My name is Mike White. I'm a professor at ASU, but I'm also the co-director of our TTA team. So I'm gonna get us started. Our purpose here is to highlight two themes. The first theme is that a good body-worn camera policy is really the centerpiece of an effective body-worn camera program. That's kind of one of our guiding philosophies. That is, a good policy will lead to good operations with regard to this technology. The second theme, when we talk about, I think a little less frequently, is that a good policy, a good body-worn camera policy will change over time. It shouldn't be static. It could change for any number of reasons. It could change because of community demands or interests. It could change because of new legislation in the state. It could change because of technology. There are any number of drivers of change, but that's really the primary focus of our webinar today, is as the title would suggest, the how and why of change in terms of body-worn camera policy. So we have a number of participants here. I think we'll ask each of the law enforcement representatives to introduce themselves as we come to their part of the presentation. I'm going to get things started and talk about some of the things that we've been doing with regard to policy and policy analysis, and then each of the law enforcement representatives will talk about their experiences with body-worn camera policy and changes and the drivers of change. And then John Markovic, Senior Policy Advisor at BJA, who's our leader in this endeavor, is going to offer some concluding remarks, and hopefully we'll have some plenty of time at the end for questions as well that we can answer. So that's kind of the approach that we're going to take. Quinn, if you want to go to the next slide, and then I believe the one after that. In terms of what we're going to try to do in the next hour or so, there's really three pieces of the webinar. The first is I'm going to talk a bit about the PIP program. If you're not familiar with it, BJ's funding program for body-worn cameras. I'm going to highlight, and John's going to help me do that. I'm going to highlight the policy review process that we've designed as part of this program to ensure that agencies that get funding have a comprehensive policy in place. And I'll highlight the work that we've been doing really for the last 7 or 8 years on looking at change in policy over time. But really what I want to do then is kind of transition to what we're doing now, the change that we've taken, so that we could really start to dig in on how policy is changing over time. And then the third part of the presentation, which you don't see on the slide, of course, is probably the most interesting part, which is to hear from our law enforcement representatives in San Antonio, Des Moines, and Houston, talking about their own experiences. So, with that, let's jump right in. I think let's get started by just talking a bit about the PIP program. And Quinn, if you move 2 slides ahead, I think I'm going to turn it over to John so he can give his perspective on the very important information that's on this slide.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to give a brief overview of the background of the body-worn camera program. It was sort of, the genesis of it was attendant to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing on the Obama administration. There was a lot of call for reform in response to some notable police shootings. So we really started the program in 2015 with appropriations geared towards providing funds for the purchase or lease of body-worn cameras. But this was not an equipment program per se. As Mike said, it was driven by policy, and it was driven more globally by sort of holistic programs that worked with stakeholders, including prosecutors' offices, internal stakeholders, unions, communities, in developing a full-blown body-worn camera program. They were relatively new in 2015, and each year we got about $20 million, a little over that, in funding. There were 2 things that we did to change and adjust. In 2020, we realized that small, rural, and tribal agencies generally don't fare as well in terms of accessing federal grants, competing for federal grants. And if they do, they find it difficult to manage. The administrative processes are rather detailed and onerous. So we developed a streamlined program called the Small, Rural, and Tribal Grant Program, which allowed us to expand our reach quite a bit geographically and reach out to agencies that might not otherwise have gotten federal funding. We continue that funding in 2021 and 2022. The other major change was we developed new purpose areas in 2022. Our funding had been pretty much for agencies that were implementing body-worn cameras by purchasing body-worn cameras or expanding their use of body-worn cameras, maybe moving them beyond just patrol to supervisory staff or adding units such as a transit unit. So they were expanding existing programs. One of the things that we recognized is there were agencies that had established programs that were making progress, but were having difficulty addressing challenges in areas of just dealing with the tsunami of digital evidence coming from not just body-worn cameras, but other devices as well. So we funded 3 areas. One is just essentially efforts to agencies that were making progress and wanted to showcase their efforts in integrating digital evidence, again, not just body-worn cameras, but across other sources. We wanted to showcase prosecutors' offices that were leveraging body-worn camera footage in exemplary ways for decision-making and for case processing. And then finally, we wanted to showcase departments that were using their own body-worn camera footage for things like constitutional policing, de-escalation training. Much of the body-worn camera footage doesn't get seen if it doesn't get involved in a trial or a referral to a prosecutor, or if it's not reviewed for supervisory reasons. But there's a lot of value in that body-worn camera footage. So many agencies are now starting to leverage that. So we wanted to showcase that. But by and large, we've funded close to over 1,200 agencies between the small, rural, and tribal program, either direct funded, some were subawards. And because of the program, we will deploy approximately 120,000 body-worn cameras. Again, we've been trying to address the needs of the field and address the needs as the ecosystem. As Mike said, as the ecosystem is evolving, as Mike said, policy is a big driver of everything we do. With that, I'll turn it back to him.
Thanks, John. As John said, policy is at the centerpiece of the PIP program. And so one of the things we did almost immediately back in 2015 was to create a process that new grantees would go through to ensure that they had a comprehensive policy. And so what we did is we created a scorecard to help us do that. And it's publicly available. You see a portion of it on this slide. The scorecard allows us to rate a policy on 9 different areas. Here you see the policy development area. There are 36 specific issues that are captured on the scorecard. And so you see a handful of those under the policy development section. You'll notice that some are in red. The ones that are in red are mandatory. So those are the issues that absolutely must be covered in the policy. These were determined by BJA. So, if you follow it across, it's not complicated. Basically, you've got the list of issues, and then there's a checkbox to see yes or no whether it's addressed in the policy. But the most important part probably is the part that's on the right, which is the evidence. That's where our TTA leads, our subject matter experts, and the agency are able to go through and to document, okay, this is how we have addressed this particular issue. So for example, the first red issue under policy development were internal agency perspectives involved in policy development, the officers, the union, IT records, things like that. You can see it's checked yes, and then you can see the evidence that's provided to support that. That's the basics of it. One really, really important point that we like to make is that the review process that we've created is only about ensuring comprehensiveness. It's not prescriptive. It's not directional. So BJA is not telling an agency, you must say X on the issue of citizen notification or whatever it might be. The review process is simply to ensure that the policy addresses the most important issues. It's up to the agency themselves with their local stakeholders to determine the specifics of the language. What position do you want to take on, say, officer authority to review or citizen notification? So the specifics are determined locally. This is just the guide to make sure that the issues are covered. Now, because this is not a prescriptive process, over the years, we've seen a ton of variation in how agencies handle specific issues. That variation has allowed us to kind of dig in deep on the specifics of things. And so we call it a policy analysis, but what we've been doing really for the last 6 or 7 years is for grantees, just characterizing positions, policy positions on particular issues. So what you see on this slide, that you see the link to the report, this is our 6-year agency report on policy, and we're approaching at this point almost 450 agency policies that we have reviewed. And again, what we're doing in this report is simply characterizing kind of the state of policy positions among grantees. And there are more than 24 different policy issues that we examine. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give you one example of what you might find if you take a look at this report. This is one policy issue that we've examined over time. It's an important one. It's one that's pretty controversial right now. The issue is an officer is involved in a critical incident, an officer involved shooting. It is captured on the body-worn camera. What is the agency's position on the sequence of events in terms of reviewing footage and making a statement? So what you see here is the percentage of agencies that say, yes, they will allow their officer to review the footage of the critical incident before they make a statement. And the way the report's organized is it's by funding year. So you can see, going all the way back to, the first years of this program, FY15, FY 2016, the vast majority of funded agencies allowed that kind of review. You actually see an example of policy language at the bottom. But it was very, very common back in the early years of this program for departments to allow their officers to have that kind of access to their footage before they would make a formal statement. And this happens to be a policy issue that's changed over time. So if you look in the more recent years, FY 2019, 2020, you can see that the percentage has dropped off quite a bit, which means that there's an increasing number of agencies who are restricting an officer's access to that footage before making a statement. So anyway, this is one example of the kind of analysis that we've done for the last 6 or 7 years. And again, if you go and you look at that report, you'll see a couple of dozen bar charts like this that allow you to examine this kind of change in policy over time. Now, we acknowledge with this approach that we've been using, there are a couple of limitations. And you see that at the top of this slide. That the first limitation is that the policy review process that grantees go through happens right away. This approach that we've been using really only captures policy as an agency is just getting started in the program. And for many of the agencies, is just getting started with body-worn cameras. So it's a snapshot of early on what's happened. The second limitation is that if you recall that previous slide, it's organized by funding year, which means every year or every bar in that graph represents really a different group of agencies that have been funded. Now, there are a handful of agencies that have been funded in multiple years, but for the most part, that's not true. So the agencies that were funded in 2015 are different than those funded in 16 and 17 and so forth. Those are some limitations. And we started off by saying that one of the important themes here is that an agency's body-worn camera policy should change over time. We recognize that the approach that we've been using doesn't capture that, which is why we moved to, I guess we'll call it the 2.0 version, that will allow us to, within a specific agency, to capture the changes that have occurred over time and then hopefully why. So for example, if we have the LAPD policy from 2016, let's go get the LAPD policy now, put them up against each other and compare them and see if they're different, and if they are different, how so. So that's exactly what we've done in this version. I'm gonna talk about some of the specifics of this before I turn it over to I believe Robert from San Antonio. But what we've done is we've gone and collected 160 current policies that are active right now of agencies that have been funded in this program. And so we already had their original policy and scorecard, when they got their grant. But now what we've done is we've gone and gotten the current one. So now we can scorecard the current, compare it to the original, and look to see where differences happen. And like I said, hopefully get to the drivers of those policy changes. Kind of the first major finding I wanted to present. So like I said, we started with 160. That is 160 departments where we've got both policies. We've got the old one they had when they they went through the grant funding program, and we've got the one they use now. Well, question number one is simply, of those 160, how many have changed from what they had originally? And we anticipated a fair amount of change, and we saw a fair amount of change. So you can see the numbers here of the 160, 131 change, which is about 82%. So again, finding number one, yes, guess what? We were right. We are seeing quite a bit of change in body-worn camera policies over time within agency change, that is. The second set of findings I wanted to show you is that we can look at where change is occurring. So remember with the scorecard, I said that it rates a policy across 9 different areas. Well, here are the 9 areas that you see. And what we're looking at now is the frequency of change which within each of those 9 areas. So for example, you can see that the area that has experienced the most change is body-worn camera viewing. And so 73% of the agencies where we've got the old and the current, 73% have experienced change in this particular area. Body-worn camera viewing involves officer authority to review, supervisor authority to review, those kinds of things. You can see the activation area is another area where there's a fair amount of change at 65%. And there's some policy areas where change is much less frequent, training, for example. So those are the first 2 sets of findings. We've got a lot of change happening, 82% of the departments that we examined. Here you see more specifics of where the changes are occurring. And if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes really getting into the nitty-gritty of policy change. And so this is what we've done. So this is a scorecard of an agency in Arizona, and the original scoring of their policy is evident. It's on the far right. You can see the date at the top. It was in February of 2017. And then what we essentially did is we just created a new column in the old scorecard, and then did the analysis of the current policy. And that allows us to, they're right next to each other right now, so we can compare the old and the current. You can see for this agency, the current policy has been in existence since December of 21. So this is a 4-year difference or a 4-year period of time since the original to the current. And what that allows us to do is to identify, and I'm not just talking about language changes, we're looking for actual changes of substance. So, and you see 2 of them here on this slide. The first is the policy issue involves discretion on activation. If you look to the right, essentially the agency had said back in 2017, no, officers really don't have any discretion at all with regard to activation. They have some language in there about if you're interviewing a victim for the most part, but for the most part, there's very limited discretion. Now move over to the highlighted part in yellow, and you can see what this same agency says right now with regard to discretion, and it's quite a bit different. They are giving their officers a fair amount of discretion in the activation decision for things that are outside of the mandatory criteria. Right below that, we see another difference for this department in Arizona, and it involves citizen notification. So in the original policy on the right, back in 2017, they simply said, you know what, you are not required to notify citizens that they're being recorded. What does the policy currently say? Well, now it's different. Now they actually encourage or recommend that notification of citizens. I've got, I think, 2 more examples to highlight the kinds of things that we're finding in this very granular review of policy change. This is an agency from Georgia, and the issue is, should officers wear their assigned body cameras during off-duty or extra-duty assignments? On the right, that was the original policy language, which said essentially, no, you're not required to wear your camera during an off-duty assignment. Fast forward to the current policy, and it's changed quite a bit. Now, officers in this agency are absolutely required to wear their camera during not only normal tours of duty, of course, but anything off-duty or extra-duty. And this is the last example I wanted to give you of kind of this nitty-gritty examination. This is an agency in Texas. The policy issue really involves supervisors having access to footage. And if you look on the far right, that's what the policy was originally. And if you read through that language, you'll see that supervisors' access was restricted quite a bit. No random reviews, no auditing. Essentially, a supervisor should only go in and look at footage in response to a specific complaint or allegation of misconduct, something like that. Flash forward to the current policy that this agency has, and can see they've made a real about face on this issue of supervisor review. Now they mandate that supervisors do review. There's that word shall, you shall conduct. So they're doing monthly random reviews for two reasons. First, for general performance review, but also reviews for adherence to the body-worn camera policy, activation, tagging, those kinds of things. So those are three very specific examples of the kinds of things that we're finding. And just real quick, our next steps, we're neck deep in this right now in terms of examining these issues. We're going to produce a report in the next probably 2 months or so that's going to be very similar in terms of the structure of that the report I showed earlier, but it's going to have this kind of new 2.0 approach. So, what we're going to be doing over the next couple of months is we're going to hone in on not the areas, but the actual policy issues that are the most stable and the most likely to change. We also want to look to see if there's consistency in change. So our agencies can consistently moving in the same direction. So for example, with supervisor authority to review, if we look at when change occurs, is it always toward giving office or supervisors more access, or are some departments going a different direction and restricting access? And then the last thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting to that why question. We're going to be interviewing agencies and trying to determine those drivers of change, because I think that really gets us to the heart of the issue, which is a good segue, because what we want to do now is get into those very specific issues with our three law enforcement representatives. And I believe Robert from San Antonio is up next, and so that each is going to introduce themselves and then talk a little bit about their experiences with regard to body-worn camera policy and change and drivers of change. So this is the handoff to you, Robert.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. My name is Robert Looney. I'm the Senior Management Analyst and Research and Planning Supervisor. The body-worn camera program basically came through my unit from start to finish as far as the implementation. To give you a little bit of an idea, we were asked by the City Council to develop a body-worn camera program in December of 2013. As John had kind of mentioned, a lot of this was precipitated by some very widely viewed and controversial events that had happened in law enforcement in the United States. So they wanted to see the program. It was early. There wasn't a lot of stuff out there just yet, but we presented a pilot program to council in February. They approved it. We moved on to testing in March of 2014, finished all our testing and evaluation in December 2014, selected a vendor in July of 2015 and began deployment in November of 2015. In the beginning, what we had to do is we needed a policy or some sort of guidelines for the officers that were going to be using the cameras in the pilot test program. Part of this was just because we wanted to make sure that we outlined it and understood what was going on. Part of it was to protect ourselves, to make sure that we had things kind of memorialized in writing. The first set of policies, or the first procedure, we surveyed a bunch of agencies, IACP information, NIJ. So if you see all of those and the recommendations matrix of the Perf COPS report, which we met most all of those. We implemented the program. We had 25 officers at each stage testing cameras. So that was, again, one of the motivators, because there was a lot of people. It wasn't just a few here and there. So we developed the policy for the pilot program in February of 2019. As I said, a lot of that was based on reaching out to a whole slew of agencies across the country, any other material that we had there. We tried to make sure that we were encompassing best practices, and that guided us through the pilot program. So once we began distribution in November of 2015, that's when we adopted our first policy. That was, there were a few changes in the policy from what we had in the pilot program. There was just minor items. One was the officer being able to view their video prior to a report, and then the other one was outlining the off-duty use of the cameras. In July of 2016, there was a clarification on a lot of the questions we had seen over the months. And then one of the things that kind of motivated that one also was In 2015, the state of Texas passed Senate Bill 158, which modified the occupation code to include body cameras and body-worn cameras in their use. Fortunately, several law enforcement agencies were part of that. So a lot of the stuff that came out of there, we felt very comfortable with. So this was the first comprehensive update. We encompassed all the items that were in the state law, such as the use of the recordings, taggings, and call for service information, what events to record, limitations on muting or stopping. And one of the big ones for us was auto tagging. We worked with our vendor to be able to develop a system where most all of the videos are tagged automatically. And then the release of video and the retention and off-duty use were kind of tweaked a little bit. The next program, the next one, this was just so minor. In essence, it was basically saying that if we had a co-ban in-car system and if that microphone malfunctioned or you didn't have to use that microphone, as long as you had the body-worn camera and were recording. So very minor change. Updates in December of 2019. There were some pretty substantial changes in that one. Again, we were looking at our experiences. Some of the things that we had discovered were problematic, as tends to happen with these things. People can become quite creative in the interpretation of policy and procedure. So there was a lot of clarification that was needed there. And we kind of outlined all of that. It was, again, experiences that we were seeing internally more than anything, and not necessarily external factors. 2020, this is when we had a big push. We'd had some controversial officer-involved shootings in San Antonio, and there was a demand for almost instant release of video. And other agencies had already developed policies on when and how long it was going to take, what kind of period of time it was going to be before they released the video or the recordings. We separated the policy into two sections. One was basically the operational. That was all the stuff on how to use it. And we added the section B, which was establishing the criteria for when the video or the recordings would be released. Initially, we had put in a 60-day window, and we kind of went with that for a while. It seemed to be working, but again, one of the things that happened is public sentiment, wanting to ensure that we maintain public trust and transparency. And then we moved on to our final change, which was really just modifying the 60 days to the 30 days for the release of the video. Interestingly enough, Senate Bill 158, the occupation code on the Texas statutes, had a stipulation there that any chief of police or sheriff could release video if they found that its release would be, or it would serve a true law enforcement purpose. So that was in there, but we wanted to make sure that we also had a section in writing so that the public could see that. And I guess, again, build trust and transparency. So some of the factors that went back, there's a collective bargaining agreement between the San Antonio Police Officers Association and the City of San Antonio. That has limitations. A lot of the limitations are more, as it relates to body cameras, are more on the disciplinary procedure and things like that. That's always something we have to keep in mind whenever we develop any policy or procedure. The Senate Bill 158, which was adopted in 2015, we try to be as responsive as we can with citizens' concerns and make sure that when there is a legitimate concern, we try to meet and resolve that issue for them. And then finally, with the changes in technology, we've gone from the very early body cameras on Axon, we're now in the body 3, so there's a lot of different things there. We're probably going to have to adjust our policy. A lot of the items that are coming out of the technology as far as live streaming, tracking, etc., are going to be issues that we're going to have to address at some point sooner than later. We're just distributing the body camera 3, and I'm sure that within the next probably month or two, we will probably do another comprehensive review of our policy and procedure and make sure that we capture everything in there that needs to be done. And I think that is it for me. Information from my contact information. Anybody have any questions, want to see copies of our policies, procedures, please feel free to contact me at any time, phone, email. And also Quinn has a package that I put together that has each of the policy versions with the changes highlighted in them, and that's hopefully will be distributed. So again, thank you.
Hello, my name's Lieutenant Theodore Stroop. I'm with the City of Des Moines Police Department, currently in the planning and budget section. When the city decided to go forward with a body camera program, I started what we call our digital evidence unit, which was the unit that was tasked with rolling out the body camera program and getting it off the ground in the first place. We did have digital in-car video prior to that. We also had COVID, same that Mr. Looney had at San Antonio. So we had a little bit of framework in place in regards to, retention of video, when we're going to record, that kind of thing. But we didn't have a comprehensive body camera policy in place at all. Our timeline is almost exactly 2 years post the San Antonio. So while I would consider us early adopters now, at the time, folks like San Antonio and Las Vegas were the true early adopters, and we learned a lot of lessons from them. The other part that we were able to take advantage of is half of our expense was JAG grant funded. And so part of the grant award required that your policy go through the BJA scorecard that we went through earlier in the presentation. And the grant wasn't awarded until your policy passed review. So we used the BJA body camera policy template to develop our initial policy. So when we hit the ground and deployed cameras, we were already running with a policy that had been scored by the BJA and approved. Some other lessons that we were able to take advantage of in the run up to deployment was New Orleans and Oakland were both under consent decrees and had deployed body cameras as part of their consent decrees. And a lot of their policy decisions had already been vetted through their consent decree process. And those folks were presenters at a lot of the conferences that we were attending, doing our research. And they were very helpful in saying, if you adopt this part of your policy, we can guarantee you it's been vetted by a federal judge as part of our consent decree. So that was very helpful. Another very helpful perspective was Las Vegas, because they were early adopters and they had obviously a lot of experience with officer involved shootings at that time, and were able to give very good advice on going forward with your audit process and some of those parts of your policy that I would say aren't up front and center to the citizens, but they're important to us. We've been lucky, contrary to what Mr. Looney's experience has been, in that the state of Iowa has largely stayed out of legislating the body camera process. They've never picked up any kind of law mandating storage, retention, the wearing of it. They've just let the departments sort that out. We've done a few updates to our open records law to bring the open records law up to date with digital evidence, but they have largely let the departments sort out the policy. I would say some of the early changes were probably more informed by experience and stuff that we were seeing in videos that we didn't like, that we maybe wanted to change through policy. For example, when we first got body cameras, we went with WatchGuard, and they had a belt clip solution. And that was actually the sturdiest mounting solution. And a lot of officers preferred the belt mount, but we weren't getting good video out of it, especially officers that were shorter or on traffic stops. The camera was aimed at the door of the car and stuff like that. So those early policy changes were more aimed at making sure that the evidence was quality and usable. I would say practical policy changes rather than demands from the citizens. So we mandated it had to be on the upper torso. I was kind of surprised to see the slide that it's still a majority of agencies that allow their officers to watch video prior to a critical incident. We had it in our policy from the get-go that Officers are allowed to watch their video to prepare use of force reports, police reports, so on and so forth. But we had a specific carve out for critical incidents where they needed to give a statement first. They would be allowed to watch their video and then give an updated statement after their video. And that's actually based on information received from Force Science Research Institute. That was their recommendation as well. So we've had that in our policy the entire time. We did have citizen pressure to update that policy to officers never get to watch their video before any preparation of any report, which is the other way, or going the other way from what we think the best practice should be. We kept it the way it is, and that portion has stayed that way. It's still, they don't get to watch it before critical incidents, and that's it. I would also say that some of our policy changes and early adoptions of the policy versus what it is now were what I would say economically based. For instance, our requirement early on, it was very patrol centric. Patrol officers or officers that were in uniform working off duty had to wear a body camera. That was the only mandatory wear requirement we had. Detectives, anybody that worked, the records desk, officers that have, for instance, somebody that works in the job I do now, I'm not required to wear a body camera. We went quite a long time with that mandatory wear policy being just for uniformed patrol officers. And the detectives had a pool so they could check out a camera if they were going to go do something where they thought they needed a body camera recording. That has since changed. If you're leaving the building to do police work, you have to have a body camera on. That's the easiest way to explain it. That's obviously not what the policy says officially, but that's basically what you're looking at now. And we also, that was a money-based decision. At the time, we didn't have enough money to issue one camera per sworn officer, and we are now up to every officer has an issued camera with 2 issued batteries. So now there's really no excuse for not having your camera available. Also, one thing I noticed early on was there was a lot of pushback from the SWAT community on wearing body cameras on entries. And it seems to me that that's fallen by the wayside. I mean, if the biggest argument was that we didn't want, through public records release, we didn't want to give away room clearing tactics. Well, anybody go on YouTube and search room clearing. And you're going to be able to watch videos on room clearing tactics conducted by special forces folks from the United States military. You can get the basics and probably advanced education online for free. So after that, we were able to convince, I think, a lot of people in that community that the self-protection was more important than protecting room clearing tactics that were public knowledge at this point. So that's also part of our policy now on our SWAT team wears them on entries. The only carve out we have is if someone's on a federal or multi-agency task force where the task force is not allowed to wear them, and the chief also says that that's okay that officer doesn't wear it. But I do know there were some pretty high profile cases of some larger agencies leaving some of the federal task forces because the federal task forces weren't letting their officers wear body cameras. And those agencies were saying, if our officers are there, they're going to be wearing body cameras. And if you're not going to let them be there with a body camera, then we're going to pull our officers from the task force. So that's another policy change I've seen, is that the feds haven't adopted body cameras like the municipal, state, and county agencies have for a myriad of reasons. I'm not being derogatory, but that those officers that are partnering with them know that it's an expectation of their citizenry to wear them. So if you want local cooperation, just assume that they're going to have body-worn cameras available. Our policy actually hasn't been, I mean, it gets reviewed on an annual basis, but the only update we've done lately is retention. And we again, I think Mr. Looney alluded to, then there's several states that have legislated retention. We changed our retention period on purpose to match our civil suit statute of limitations, but that was something we did internally. It wasn't done by legislation. So the civil suit retention period didn't change statutorily. We just recognized that we were losing videos that were then being brought up in lawsuits. So we changed on our own. Those are probably the 3 biggest things: is detectives wearing them, SWAT team wearing them, and then making sure that they're on a portion of your body where you get the best possible protection for the officer. That's it for me.
I guess I'm up next. My name's Kyle Kirkup. I'm at the Houston Police Department. I'm an IT manager. I actually started with Houston in 2014, and the body camera program started around that, and I've been involved since the beginning. In 2014, HPD started a pilot program with 100 cameras. Based on that pilot program, they decided to move forward. 2015, we went out for our RFP to purchase body cameras. And in April 2016, we started our first deployment of cameras. From the 2015 to 2016 timeframe, our policy was developed. Like other agencies, we certainly reached out to other agencies. We used available resources from major city chiefs, IACP, PERF, all the DOJ literature that was available. However, being a large agency with 5,000 plus officers, there weren't a lot of large agencies, at our scale that were out there. But we did use what we had available. We also were a BJA grant recipient, so our policy had to be reviewed as well, which was nice. We're a Texas agency, like Mr. Looney's agency, but we didn't develop our policy until after the occupation code had changed in 2015. So we did not have to, our policy started off with the new occupation code in Texas, and based from there. The policy development for Houston was, I don't know if it was unique, but I was very much pleased with how the policy development went. We got citizen input. We had a series of town halls across Houston in different council member districts, and police representatives and union representatives and the public were all invited to go and discuss the policy that was, in draft forms at various times. So we got a lot of citizen input. We got union input. We had city council input. We did make the decision that the body cam policy was always going to be public. So since April of 2016, our body camera policy has been published online. It's available to the public at all times. And every time we change it or update it, we post the new policy up there. Along with the initial policy, we also formed a BWC committee that was mostly formed of sergeants. The criteria were the supervisors had to wear a body camera and had to supervise officers that had a body camera. And they meet quarterly or as needed. And mostly what they'll do is review policy. They'll review procedures. They'll review what the officers are actually doing, and they'll decide or recommend changes. We kind of use the people, problems, and procedures type methodology to decide whether we should consider changing the policy. And what I mean by that is you write a policy and then, can your people actually do it? Do those procedures actually work with what a police officer has to do in a daily grind? So our policies changed in a few areas, probably similar to the other agencies. The first area was from the BJA review. There was some requests from BJA to not necessarily change, but to revamp some of the wording and to go a little bit more in depth in the areas of recording notification, privacy concerns, traumatic events that concern victims and witnesses, and then the use of BWC for training. So we took those into considerations, and those were probably our first changes. I think our biggest change is in the activation procedures. So initially, HPD had probably a less restrictive activation. We allowed officers more latitude to interpret when they should activate, when they should stop recording during a situation, which Texas law allows officers to stop a recording. They're not required to record 24 hours, not required to record the entire event continuously. However, that yielded results that were inconsistent across HPD. So our policy has changed from least restrictive to more restrictive. So essentially an officer that arrives on a call that has to be recorded, they're required to have their body cam on prior to arriving and to leave that body camera on the whole time. That would go into our second change is muting. So with mute capabilities, HPD decided to, instead of allowing officers to stop the recording, we would use the mute feature so that we could conceal, what was being said, but we would allow the body camera to continue running and recording the scene. And that is a lot less problematic in court because the defense attorneys can see that everything's going on and nothing's being hidden. We just provide privacy for what's being said. So that has been, at this point, has probably been received better by the officers than trying to turn the camera off. The BWC use for extended scenes is another area where we've had some changes. So in the early days, probably like everybody else, while we did get funding from the BJA, and we're grateful for that, body cameras are a pretty big cost and expense and an ongoing expense. So we were on-prem with our storage, so we had to buy storage and store everything. So there were some considerations as to how long we were going to allow people to record, and there was size constraints. So sometimes with extended scenes, we were unsure whether we should leave cameras on or turn cameras off. We were getting a lot of intersection camera videos where officers were manning a post and blocking off an intersection, which is probably not really relevant. So that's been a fairly big policy change. So we kind of have an inner and outer scene. The inner scene, those cameras stay on. The outer scene, the cameras can be turned off with a supervisory acknowledgement that it's okay to do so. So they are situationally dependent. If there is something going on in the outer scene that's law enforcement related that needs to be recorded, the supervisor will make that decision. But now they can tell officers that they can turn their cameras off if it's deemed that there's no evidentiary value of where they're at. And then also on a regular scene, officers used to be able to shut their cameras down. They could state why they were doing it, but now that requires supervisory approval before they can turn their camera off. The preferred method is to, or the required method is to put their cameras on mute. And if they do something, but if they feel they need to turn their camera off, the policy does allow that, but it now requires a supervisor to make that decision. We went through random audits. We had some sergeants that have exceptionally large numbers of people under them. So to do random audits in some videos are hours plus is a big tax on them. So from this committee, they said, listen, we're already doing pursuit, response to resistance. Someone makes a complaint, we witness something on scene and we go back and review it. We're already reviewing an awful lot of video. So we only had a requirement for 2 videos per month to be supervisory audited. That was reduced down to 1 because of all the other reasons. There's a lot of video being reviewed by supervisors, other than that. So we now consider those part of, random audit as well. So we do have a random audit requirement of 1 video per supervisor, plus pursuits, which involves both foot and vehicular. And anytime there's response to resistance, those are all mandatory reviews. So it's a lot of video that's being reviewed. The supervisories revising complaints, a little off topic, but it's been a great tool. It hasn't really changed our policy, but it has allowed a lot of our officers to avoid the IA process because supervisors are able to quickly review video and even see whether there's any merit or not, and also goes to the IED review, and they could see that officers really didn't do what they're being accused of. So the review of that video and then having the body cam video and the policy changes that require officers to have the video camera on has largely been a benefit to the officers because it's captured events and incidents that may not necessarily have been captured that have gone and helped the officers. It's also helped the prosecution and with the municipal court and for use in other legal proceedings. Another area that we had is who wears the BWC. So like a lot of agencies, we were cost conscious. And like I said, we have 5,100, 5,200 officers here. About 4,800 of those are in patrol. So the body cameras for everybody. We're a large agency and everybody always thinks we got the lion's share of money, but that's not really true. We have the budget constraints everybody else does. So we had to be cost conscious and largely our body cameras were with patrol officers, and sergeants. We've now expanded that to a lot of our patrol lieutenants are wearing it, but we also have our other units that go out and do, it's not like Iowa, where if you're going out and doing police work, you have to wear a camera. But if you're going out and serving a warrant, you're going to do an execution of an arrest or search warrant, that those detectives or those officers that might normally be in plainclothes, they're going to be required to wear a body camera. So all warrants that are served, all search warrants that are served, those units have to wear body cameras. That's been an expansion. And that largely affects our SWAT and our narcotics task force teams that are going out. SWAT was a big, one of the agencies that mentioned SWAT. So we were the same way. They were initially hesitant, but they have also now adopted body cameras for use. And the extended scene kind of rolls onto them because SWAT scenes by definition are generally extended scenes. So there is that requirement for them, or the allowance for them to have cameras, but also to turn the camera off if they're in an area where it's not necessary. We had originally started because due to the cameras and how many we had, the extra job policy for our officers, we only had certain designated extra jobs that required the use of a body worn camera. Now that we have sufficient cameras, we've recently changed our policy that any officer that works an extra job of any type now has to have a body worn camera. And that policy changes has literally just recently gone into effect a couple months ago. We've had some policy changes with technology, but the way our policy is written is not necessarily affected by an increase in technology. That we've had triggers and the ability to go back and record or get video that was not recorded at the time. That policy changes in review right now, and that'll probably be our next big policy change. So we have a camera that has a technology called record after the fact. We call it officer initiated recording, but they can, if the camera was on and they did not hit the button to actually record that event at the time, they can go back at a later date and we can get that video and create that event. So some of the things that didn't change, those are largely retention is one of the other things that changed. So we have statutorily, we have a 90-day requirement in Texas. But we at Houston exceed that. So we did change our retention to a more, what we felt was more realistic and more useful for HPD use and for law enforcement purposes. So that has evolved over time and that has changed. We probably changed that in our policy about a year ago to our new retention. So we kind of have 3 retentions. We keep casual contact for a year. We keep our Class C in traffic for 3 years and our Class B pluses for 10 years. So we try to keep it simple with our retentions. What didn't change was our officers have to say why they're deactivating their camera. So from an original policy that has remained the same. So if they're turning their camera off, even if it's just to end the scene or they're clearing, they do have to articulate why they're turning the camera off. If they have a late activation of their camera, so they're supposed to have their camera on prior to arriving on the scene, but if they do get on scene or they do jump out for an on view and they don't have time to get the camera on, they're supposed to announce why they have a late activation of the camera. We also had a requirement that we recognize that it's a big city, officers going to have a camera. If they work an extra job and they didn't have to take any law enforcement action, we didn't necessarily need that video right away. So we allowed them to come in the next day, bring that camera back and download it. But we've always had the requirement that any Class B offense or above, or anytime you took law enforcement action, that you had to come back and download that video that day. That policy that has been consistent through the policy. We have allowed the officers to review their video prior to writing reports, and that has remained consistent. And then we require the officers to review their evidence and their videos, prior to going to court. So those are the things that have remained the same. But HPD concept with the kind of living document, making it available to the public, we recognized from the beginning that our policy was going to be a living policy. We were going to have to react to political or social events that had happened, the will of the people and things that happen in the news. And there's been some significant events that have happened nationwide and within the city of Houston that have caused us to look at that policy, and that's going to continue to happen. But the concept has always been that that's a living document. We're always going to constantly review it and try to make changes that are reasonable and prudent. And so thank you for your time.
Great. I think this is John Markovic. Again, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at BJA, and I oversee the body worn camera program. So thanks for a great dynamic discussion. I think Kyle said it well. These policies are living documents. They need to be responsive to internal and external changes, to changes in technology. And as Mike alluded, I think we're going to be diving into not just what the changes are, but towards a better understanding of what the drivers of those changes are. So this discussion today has really helped us frame that. Wow, we're running out of time. We don't have time for a lot of questions. I think I'd just make a quick comment that I think this sort of vindicated our approach at the outset of the body worn camera program. As Mike said, we're not prescriptive. We want the policies to be thorough, thoughtful, and deliberate, but the practices are evolving as the technology and law evolves. There may be areas where there may be standard practice and best practice, and maybe a movement towards universal policy. Elliot from CNA did put something in the Q&A that I want to address. A couple of things. I think his lieutenant mentioned that he was surprised that agencies still have moved toward, or agencies allow officers to view their body worn camera footage before writing reports on critical incidents. That I think is changing. Indeed, there's now an executive order that's charged DOJ and other entities to look at what the best practices are, what are the pros and cons of those. So we're sorting that through that now. And thanks for the tip about Force Science Research Institute. We've been talking to some experts, but I don't think we included them. So I'll go look at that report and see what they say. And generally, the justification revolves around Graham versus Connor, and the idea is that you want to get the officer's initial impression of what is reasonable rather than the retrospective interpretation that adds facts learned when viewing the body worn cameras. It gets into more nuance than that, but I think that's essentially that. And then also the issue of task forces was mentioned, where agencies were running into issues where federal task forces did not allow them to use body worn cameras. That's changing now with the executive order and the fact that federal law enforcement agencies are now moving towards using body worn cameras themselves. And it's, again, more of the presumptive use rather than the discretionary use that seems to be the direction. Those are still evolving. So with that, I will thank the speakers for being responsive, for sort of giving us the view from the field. Thanks, Mike, for facilitating, Quinn for setting this up, and all of the rest of the folks at CNA who continue to put these webinars together and keep our TTA work moving forward. So thanks, stay tuned. If there are additional questions, you can, I think, reply to Quinn's email when he sends out this information, and we'll circle back and answer those for those of you who have questions that weren't able to ask them today. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thanks, and see you the next webinar.